Hey you, welcome to the GreyTalks podcast. Talks about great thinking, social skills, communication, personal development and team coaching. Because in a world that is black and white, we can all use some gray. My name is Lisette van Putten and I will be having these talks with you. I'm a social skills teacher and coach and I will be sharing my thoughts, knowledge and practical tips to create your own greatness. So stay tuned and enjoy this brand new episode. Got my notes, so I'm good to go. Welcome to a new episode of the Great Talks podcast, episode number 11 already. And this episode is all about the great boundaries, about setting boundaries, how to keep those boundaries, and also how to decide where those boundaries are actually lying. So, I've been mentioning already a couple of times that it is important to understand and recognize your own emotions and feelings for you to be able to actually communicate your needs and your expectations. And that link between being able to recognize, label, understand your feelings and emotions and communicating your needs and expectations, that link, setting boundaries, that is exactly what we're going to talk about this episode. Because the previous episode we talked about emotions, and this episode we're gonna continue that talk and talk about boundaries. Because it takes a lot of courage to recognize and acknowledge your boundaries and to make sure that they are kept by yourself and by others. So, when we talk about setting boundaries, we tend to think about how we have to set boundaries because we are too flexible and we're too open with the boundaries that we might have or not even have, and how we can get stuck because of that. But it's also when people are setting really fixed and rigid boundaries, and how that can also get you stuck as well. So it's more about how you can actually set healthy boundaries. When you are very flexible with your boundaries and they're very open, you might recognize the fact that you get too involved in other people's problems. You have a hard time saying no. You overshare on personal information and you are really pleasing people a lot. Maybe because of the fear of getting rejected as well. Because when you don't have healthy boundaries, it is hard to know when to stop sharing and when to stop caring as well, and when to stop pleasing, because you are not keeping your own healthy boundaries that actually work for you. You tend to do a lot of things that also can cause people to cross your boundaries very easily. So when it comes to knowing that you aren't able to say no because you are a people pleaser, for instance, that people can actually take advantage of that fact when they know that you cannot say no. And also when you get involved in other people's problems, they also know when to find you because you might be the person that will actually help them because you haven't set any boundaries when it comes to that. But when we talk about rigid boundaries, that also can get you stuck because that way you might seem detached and you don't have any close relationships because you're keeping people at a distance. So you have very strict, fixed boundaries, but then it actually is really hard to connect with that person. And both types of boundaries are unhealthy. When you have a flexible way of setting boundaries where there are actually none, or when you have a very rigid, fixed way of setting boundaries, when there's like a lack of connection. But what we want is healthy boundaries. And healthy boundaries are where you can actually understand what it is that you need, what it is that you want, and how to communicate that. And that is exactly what I've been telling you when I talk about being able to recognize your feelings and emotions, being able to label them, to understand them, to know what they mean, what they are telling you, and to teach you what it is that you actually need, what it is that you expect, what it is that you really want. And because you are aware of that and you understand it, that makes it easier to communicate them. Another thing that is very important when it comes to healthy boundaries is to value your own opinion. So when you are learning to understand and recognize your own feelings and emotions and what it is that you are thinking about a certain situation, it is your truth. And to understand that better, you also learn how you can actually value your own opinion and set a boundary that is your perspective, your truth, and someone else might have a different opinion about that, but that doesn't make it okay to cross your boundaries and to make it look as if your opinion doesn't matter in that particular situation. When it comes to healthy boundaries, it's not only easier to tell others no when it comes to your boundaries and keeping those boundaries, but it will also make it easier for you to accept when others are telling you no, because you understand where they are coming from. You know the the process, the value of their boundaries as well, and you want them to meet and keep your boundaries as well. So it will be easier to accept no of others, and it will feel less of a rejection when they tell you no. It's just them keeping their boundaries and expressing their needs and their wants, because they also assessed their own feelings and emotions and what they are telling them and what that means for their needs and expectations. So the better you know yourself, the easier it gets to set boundaries. Situations, settings, events, and people are very important when it comes to setting boundaries, because sometimes it's harder to actually set boundaries than in other situations or with other people. And it's very important to unravel why it is that in that particular situation or with that person, it is harder to set those boundaries and to keep them as well. Maybe it feels like there are consequences when it comes to setting those boundaries. So it feels like you might lose something because of the boundary that you will set. And that can actually make it harder. So, for instance, with work, you can have certain consequences when it comes to setting boundaries, which makes it hard to set those boundaries when you might lose a promotion or you might not get the commission. It can also feel as if there are certain conditions to the relationship, whether or not you can or can't set certain boundaries. So, for instance, with family, it might be harder to set certain boundaries because they're family and there is this family culture that you are living in, and it comes with certain norms and certain values where setting boundaries might be a lot harder. And it can also be harder to set boundaries because you might wonder whether or not it's worth to set those boundaries because of the consequences or the conditions. And that is also why it is important to value your own opinion and value your own worth. Because when it comes to setting boundaries, it is all about valuing your time, your mind, your body, your skills. So it's more than just saying no to something, it is about valuing yourself and respecting yourself to actually set those boundaries and to keep them as well. So setting boundaries is definitely something that you can learn, even though setting boundaries for yourself within yourself is one of the hardest thing to do. But setting boundaries is teachable. You can train that by making sure you understand, recognize your own feelings, your own emotions, how to address them, how to label them, what they actually mean to you, and to translate that to your personal needs and your expectations, and being able to communicate that. And when it comes to telling others, the more often you do it and the more often you express your wants, your needs, your expectations, the easier it gets. And it also gets easier to keep your boundaries because you have been very clear from the start and you've already set your boundaries. So that way it's easier to keep them. And that way you can also train to say no without explaining yourself, or at least not explain yourself into detail and go on and on and on about it, and maybe start oversharing personal information, as we saw when you are very flexible when it comes to setting boundaries. That is something that people can do, like explaining themselves and actually repeating and sharing, oversharing personal information. Because the explanation that you give to keep your boundary, whether it's no without any explanation or just a little, but not go into detail, it's not a condition for the boundary that you set. So you've set your boundary, and when someone is at the verge of crossing that boundary, you are keeping it, so you're telling them no. It's not a condition that you have to explain yourself when you say no. So don't feel that the only way to keep your boundaries is to also explain yourself why you are saying no. When you've communicated your needs and your expectations beforehand, that's also a way of setting those boundaries. Then people, if they are emotional intelligent and they have empathy and they are aware of the boundaries that you set, then they don't need an explanation when you say no. So that's it for this episode. We talked about boundaries and the different types of boundaries. You have rigid boundaries where you keep others at a distance and you might seem detached and not have very close relationships because it's harder to get that connection. You also have flexible and open boundaries where you are pleasing others, where you are really involved in other people's problems, where you overshare personal information, and you find it really difficult to say no. And then there are the healthy boundaries, and that's the boundaries that we really want to set and that we want to keep. And those healthy boundaries are when you understand your own needs, wants, and your expectations, and you're able to communicate them. It's when you value your own opinion and you also accept when others tell you no. And then we talked about how it is important that you know yourself and understand your feelings and your emotions in order to be able to set those boundaries, and how people and situations can make it harder to actually set those boundaries, and that it is important to unravel why that is, to actually understand that as well, to learn from it, and to teach yourself how to set those boundaries, because it is definitely teachable to learn how to set boundaries and how to keep them. And also in this episode, I'm going to share a great trigger and a great tip. So a great trigger for me when it comes to boundaries is that one moment when you realize that you aren't keeping your own boundaries, that you're not sticking to them. And for me, that's a trigger because then I start panicking, then I start doubting myself, then I get really worried, and then I get into that overthinking mode about myself, about others, what it means that I haven't kept my boundary, that I just have people crossing my boundaries. So that moment when I realized that that happened, that is actually a real trigger for me. When it comes to a great tip, I think that we consider that when boundaries aren't set from the get-go, we are not able and we are not quote unquote allowed to reset those boundaries. And I'm trying to also teach myself and to implement it more, that even when I haven't set clear boundaries in the beginning, with a certain situation or with certain people, that doesn't mean that I am not allowed to set or reset boundaries when it comes to my own needs, wants, and expectations. And of course, I will have to communicate that as well. So it's very important to be aware of that process, the emotions, the feelings, being able to recognize them, to understand them, and to transfer that into those needs and wants, and to communicate them. And that way I am able to actually, even in a further state, I can still set boundaries. It's not fixed already because I haven't done that in the beginning. So, as a tip, I think it is important to believe that we can always set boundaries. Even if we haven't set them early on, we can still set boundaries and make sure that we keep them and that others keep them too. Thank you for listening to this episode of GreyTalks. Please let me know what you think, ask me anything, and spread greatness by sharing these talks with everyone you think needs a little bit more grey. Don't forget to be great until our next GreyTalk.